Before the millions, the knockouts, Jorge Masvidal was just a kid from Miami, fighting in backyards for rent money. He didn't come from privilege. He didn't have a path. He fought because there was nothing else. From viral street scraps to UFC main events, Masvidal built a career out of grit, timing, and raw violence. In 2019, he became a superstar, the face of street justice in a polished sport. But just as fast as he rose, he fell. Fame replaced hunger. Headlines replaced focus. And the fighter who once symbolized authenticity got lost in ego, lawsuits, and 4 straight losses. What happened to Gamebred? How did a man of the people become a cautionary tale? This is the story of Jorge Masvidal, the fighter who made it out, and may have left too much behind. Before he was a pay-per-view draw, before the flying knee, before the title fights and presidential handshakes, Jorge Masvidal was a ghost moving through Miami's backstreets, fighting not for fame, but for survival. Born on November 12, 1984, Jorge's childhood was marked by instability and hardship. His father, a former Cuban political prisoner, came to the U.S. by building a homemade raft. Soon after arriving, he was arrested again, this time for drug trafficking. He would spend much of Jorge's early life in prison. That absence left a hole, one that would be filled with street fights, restless nights, and a hunger for something more. Masvidal grew up in one of Miami's roughest neighborhoods, a place where trouble wasn't around the corner. It lived on your doorstep. He was scrappy, fearless, and drawn to chaos. School didn't stick. Rules never made sense. But he could fight, and in that world, that was enough. As a teenager, Jorge bounced between gyms and corners, training when he could, brawling when he had to. He began boxing, wrestling, learning pieces of combat wherever he could find them, but it wasn't until he crossed paths with the late Kimbo Slice, YouTube's first street fighting superstar, that Masvidal's legend began. Kimbo's crew filmed bare-knuckle backyard fights. No gloves, no referees, just fists and asphalt. Masvidal stepped into that world with zero hesitation. In one of the most infamous clips, he squares off against a much larger man in a raw, unforgiving brawl. Jorge picks him apart with footwork and head movement like he was born to do it. Calm, cold, clinical. That video went viral before the word viral meant anything. The underground knew his name. He wasn't polished. He wasn't trained for the spotlight. But there was something real in the way he fought. He had the instincts of a killer, the timing of a boxer, and the patience of a veteran. He fought like someone who'd been there before, because he had. But Jorge didn't want to stay a backyard fighter. He wanted to prove he could hang with the best. And so he transitioned to the pro scene. Not with hype or a management team, but with a duffel bag, a mouthpiece, and a chip on his shoulder. He wasn't the product of a camp or a machine. He was forged in concrete. But in the world of sanctioned violence, instinct isn't enough. And Jorge was about to learn what it meant to fight for recognition, not just survival. Jorge Masvidal's pro debut didn't come with cameras or hype, no press tour, no viral promos, just another unknown name on a fight card in a smaller promotion. But for those who watched closely, it was obvious. This wasn't just a brawler. This was a fighter. Throughout the early 2000s, Jorge bounced from promotion to promotion. Bodog, Bellator, Shark Fights, Strikeforce. He faced every style, every background. Kickboxers, wrestlers, Muay Thai specialists, jiu-jitsu tacticians. He won some, lost others. But always, he came to fight. In 2009, he met TUF legend Toby Imada and suffered one of the most shocking defeats in MMA history. Choked unconscious standing in a rare inverted triangle. The clip went viral for all the wrong reasons. But Masvidal didn't run. He never made excuses. He kept fighting, kept climbing. Eventually, he earned a spot in Strikeforce, where he went on a run that led to a lightweight title shot against Gilbert Melendez in 2011. Masvidal lost a gritty, competitive decision, but proved he could hang with world-class opposition. Still, recognition eluded him. No bonuses, no buzz, just another loss on paper. In 2013, Strikeforce folded into the UFC, and Jorge Masvidal finally arrived in the big leagues. And yet, even there, he remained in the shadows. Between 2013 and 2017, Masvidal fought 10 times in the UFC. His opponents included killers like Michael Chiesa, Ross Pearson, Al Iaquinta, Donald Cerrone, and Demian Maia. He won fights, lost razor-thin decisions, was competitive in every outing, but he never got the promotional push, never cracked through into star territory. Part of it was his style, too technical to be reckless, too calm to be flashy. He fought like a craftsman, not a showman. And in the Conor McGregor era of sound bites and personas, Jorge's stoic demeanor didn't generate headlines. He became the sport's unofficial gatekeeper, the fighter they gave rising stars to test them. If you could beat Masvidal, you were ready. If you couldn't, you weren't. He was respected, admired by hardcore fans, but largely unknown to casuals. What made it harder to swallow was how close he came. Again and again. He lost split decisions to Benson Henderson and Lawrence Larkin. Another razor-thin loss to Ali Aquinta. Many thought he won all three, but the record said otherwise. And then came UFC 217 in 2017, a high-profile bout against Stephen Wonderboy Thompson. Masvidal looked flat. He lost, clearly. No controversy, no excuses. After that, Jorge disappeared. No fights, no interviews, no noise, just gone. And when he finally came back, he wasn't the same fighter. He was something far more dangerous. After his loss to Wonderboy, Jorge Masvidal did something few fighters in his position ever do. He walked away. No contract dispute, no injury, just silence. He vanished from the spotlight and resurfaced in the Dominican Republic, not to train, but to compete on a Spanish-language reality show called Exatlon USA, a sort of physical survival competition. It was televised, grueling, humbling, and completely unrelated to MMA. But Masvidal wasn't there to chase clout. He was there to suffer, to simplify, to rediscover the reason he started fighting in the first place. Stripped of coaches, nutritionists, and fight hype, Jorge returned to his roots: grit, hunger, and pain. He trained alone, ran jungle trails barefoot, shadowboxed on beaches, and spent months reflecting on the career that had slipped between his fingers. When he came back to the UFC, fans were skeptical. Over a year off? A reality show? Inactivity after a one-sided loss? Now, no one expected much. Then came March 2019. Jorge Masvidal versus Darren Till, London. Hostile crowd. Till, the undefeated hometown hero, was being fast-tracked to a title shot. Jorge was the opponent, not the story. And then, Masvidal shut the lights off. A brutal left hook in the second round sent Till crashing to the canvas. The arena fell silent, the crowd in shock. Jorge stared down, cold and calm, like it was personal, like he'd never really left. But the night wasn't over. Backstage, during a post-fight interview, Leon Edwards walked by and said something. Jorge walked over, hands behind his back, and delivered a three-piece and a soda. A quick combo that stunned Leon, security, and the internet. Within hours, Jorge Masvidal was viral for all the right reasons. It wasn't just that he could fight. It was that he reminded people what fighting really was. Raw, unscripted, real. And just like that, the quiet journeyman became a threat, a meme, a fan favorite, a headline. But he wasn't finished, not even close. Because in his very next fight, Jorge Masvidal would deliver the fastest knockout in UFC history and change his life forever. 2019 didn't just change Jorge Masvidal's career, it transformed his entire identity. After his viral knockout of Darren Till in London and the infamous backstage combo against Leon Edwards, Masvidal was no longer a journeyman. He was a problem. And more importantly, he was a story. Fans wanted more, and they got it in the most violent way possible. UFC 239, July 6, 2019. Jorge Masvidal versus Ben Askren. Askren was a former Olympian, undefeated, and known for smothering wrestling. He was all caved Askren's skull. The crowd exploded. Askren was unconscious before he hit the mat. It was the fastest KO in UFC history, a moment that instantly went viral, replayed millions of times across every platform. Masvidal didn't celebrate wildly. He leaned over Askren's limp body and pounded the mat mockingly. He knew what he had done. It wasn't just a win, it was a statement, a resurrection. Overnight, Jorge Masvidal became the UFC's breakout star. Not a champion, not even a top contender, but a name, a brand, a personality fans couldn't stop watching. Interviews flooded in, appearances, sponsorships. The streets had finally found their king. And then came the belt that wasn't about rankings. It was about image, the BMF title. UFC 244, Jorge Masvidal versus Nate Diaz at Madison Square Garden. The UFC created a custom belt. The Rock was flown in to present it. Celebrities filled the front row. The sport leaned all the way into Jorge's new persona, a gangster with discipline, a fighter with edge. He didn't disappoint. Jorge battered Diaz for 3 rounds, slicing him up with elbows, kicks, body shots. A doctor stoppage gave him the win, but Masvidal had already proved his point. He was no longer a cult favorite. He was a pay-per-view headliner, a box office force. 2019 ended with Jorge Masvidal as the clear breakout fighter of the year. He wasn't just relevant, he was redefining what relevance looked like in MMA. And yet, something subtle had shifted. The hunger that came from being overlooked was now replaced by attention, applause, wealth. For the first time in his career, Jorge wasn't chasing opportunity. He was managing fame. And when the money and spotlight grew, so did the distractions. The fighter who once had nothing, now had everything to lose. After 2019, Jorge Masvidal had a new problem. He wasn't just fighting opponents anymore. He was fighting to maintain an image. The UFC leaned into his street-born persona. So did Jorge. He began dressing like a character from Scarface, channeling Miami heat, Cuban roots, and gangster charisma. Gold chains, open shirts, hair slicked back. His walkouts became events. He was no longer just a fighter, he was a figurehead. The money started rolling in. Sponsors, endorsements, pay-per-view points. Masvidal launched his own fight promotion, Gamebred FC, built around bare-knuckle MMA. He talked about financial independence, running Miami, becoming more than just a name on a poster. And for a while, it worked. But the sharper turn came politically. Jorge publicly backed Donald Trump. He began appearing at rallies, took photos with the former president, made speeches at Latino voter events. He became a conservative mascot, praised on Fox News, quoted in speeches, retweeted by Trump himself. It divided fans instantly. Some praised his outspokenness. Others said he sold out. But Jorge didn't care. He leaned in. His interviews became more combative, more ideological. He talked less about fight technique and more about values, politics, pride. The street fighter had become a media figure. And then came the feud that shattered his image from the inside. Colby Covington, former friend, former roommate, former teammate, had also transformed himself into a political firebrand. The two once trained side by side at American Top Team, but egos, alliances, and personal betrayals drove them apart. The tension simmered online, in gyms, in media. Colby accused Masvidal of ducking him. Jorge called Colby a traitor. It was no longer hype, it was real. But while the feud built, something else was slipping. Masvidal wasn't fighting. Months passed. Rumors of contract disputes swirled. He rejected title shots over pay, turned down offers, talked more than he trained, and when he finally did fight again, the results would show exactly what fame had taken from him. The spotlight had been blinding. But in the darkness of the octagon, reality was waiting, and it came wearing gold. April 2020. The world was locked down. Sports were frozen, but the UFC pressed on. Kamaru Usman needed a challenger for the welterweight title, and with 6 days' notice, Jorge Masvidal stepped up. The fight was sold as a miracle. Short notice savior, street fighter versus champion, BMF versus the belt. UFC 251 broke records. But the fight? A grind. Usman wrestled Masvidal against the cage for 5 rounds, shutting down every opening. Jorge had moments. Elbows, knees, flashes of energy, but nothing decisive. He survived. He fought, but he was outclassed. Still, fans gave him credit. 6 days, no camp. Run it back with a full camp, they said. Jorge agreed. 10 months later, UFC 261. Masvidal versus Usman 2. This time, no excuses. Jorge had a full camp, in shape, motivated, confident. He smiled through fight week, called Usman soft, promised violence, laughed off predictions. Then the bell rang. The first round was competitive. Jorge landed clean shots, stuffed a few takedowns. But in round 2, Usman timed a right hand that landed with the weight of a hammer. Jorge's head snapped back. Sweat flew into the air like dust from a dying star. His body folded, out cold. It was the first time Masvidal had been knocked out in his 50-plus fight career. The image went viral, not as a highlight of Jorge's glory, but as a meme of his demise. The fighter who had knocked out Ben Askren with a flying knee was now lying flat on his back, motionless. And the silence after the knockout was louder than any cheer he'd ever heard. For Jorge, it was more than a loss. It was a mirror, a reminder that in the pursuit of image, the fighter had been left behind. The hunger that built him was now buried under interviews, suits, sunglasses, and slogans. He was still Jorge Masvidal, but something was missing, and as he searched for redemption, he made one more decision that would shatter everything he had left. Some rivalries are built for promotion, others are personal. This one was both. Jorge Masvidal versus Colby Covington wasn't just two names on a poster. It was betrayal, ego, and brotherhood turned bitter. Once teammates at American Top Team, they'd shared rooms, meals, corners. Jorge called Colby family. Colby said Jorge made him tougher, but as both men rose in fame, the bond began to crack. Colby accused Jorge of jealousy. Jorge said Colby stiffed their coach. The media loved it. Two trash talkers with real history, circling like sharks. But behind the headlines, this wasn't entertainment. It was hate. In March 2022, the UFC finally booked it. UFC 272, Las Vegas. The promotion was electric. Interviews were venomous. They brought up each other's families, careers, bank accounts. Jorge painted Colby as a fraud. Colby called Jorge a deadbeat dad. Fans picked sides. But deep down, they weren't sure if it was all just hype. It wasn't. The fight itself, one-sided. Colby out-wrestled Jorge, smothered him, taunted him mid-fight. Jorge had flashes. A clean right hand in round 4 that stunned Colby, but nothing sustained. After 5 rounds, Covington left the cage victorious, arms raised, middle fingers flying. Jorge left with his head down, but the fight wasn't over. 2 weeks later, in Miami, Jorge found Colby outside a steakhouse. No gloves, no lights, no rules. He attacked him from behind, allegedly punching him twice in the face, breaking a tooth. Colby filed charges. Masvidal was arrested and later released on bond. The street had returned. In that moment, the character and the man collided, and neither came out clean. For a fighter who had built his image on realness, Jorge had crossed a line. Some fans supported it. Others saw it for what it was. A man unraveling in public, refusing to let go of a feud he had already lost. The court case made headlines. Colby pressed charges. Masvidal refused to apologize. The UFC went quiet. Sponsors backed away. And worse, it didn't feel like the actions of a man with something to prove. It felt like the actions of a man who had nothing left to lose. The aftermath of the Colby Covington fight marked a new chapter for Jorge Masvidal. Not one of redemption, but of slow erosion. The court case dragged on. The media frenzy faded. And Jorge, once the most talked-about fighter in the UFC, began to vanish again. But this time, there was no reinvention, no reality show, no resurrection. There was just decline. In April 2023, Masvidal fought Gilbert Burns at UFC 287, his first fight in over a year. It was in Miami, his hometown, a card seemingly built to give him one last shot at glory. But it wasn't a comeback, it was a farewell. From the opening round, Burns controlled the pace. He outstruck Jorge, out-wrestled him, outworked him. Jorge looked hesitant, slower, less sharp. The timing that once made him deadly, gone. He wasn't overwhelmed, he was outclassed. The fight ended with a unanimous decision loss. 4 straight defeats. The same man who once headlined Madison Square Garden and stole entire years of UFC highlight reels now looked like a veteran just hanging on. After the fight, Masvidal took off his gloves and laid them in the center of the octagon. The crowd stood and cheered, not because of the fight, but because of the legacy. Because for a brief stretch of time, Jorge was the fight game. On the mic, he thanked his fans, praised Miami, and said it was time. "I don't feel the same when I get in here no more," he admitted. "I love all of you. Thank you." And just like that, the street fighter was gone. But retirement didn't bring peace. His promotion, Gamebred FC, struggled with visibility and revenue. He faced lawsuits over contracts and business deals. His reputation, once grounded in authenticity, was questioned. Appearances became sparse. He went from main event to afterthought in under 12 months. For a fighter who once rose by staying raw, Jorge now looked uncertain, not broken, but hollow. A man who had given the sport everything, only to find there was nothing left to take from it. Jorge Masvidal's career is a paradox. He never won a UFC title. He lost more fights than most champions ever take. His win-loss record is peppered with splits, streaks, and slips. On paper, he's not a legend, but paper never told the whole story. Masvidal's impact wasn't measured in belts. It was measured in moments. A flying knee that broke time. A backstage combo that turned into a meme. A year, 2019, when he made the world watch, not because the UFC told them to, but because he gave them something real. That's rare in MMA. Fighters come and go, but few ever capture the culture. Jorge did. He was the last street fighter, the final product of a bygone bygone era where fights didn't start with marketing, but with eye contact and a fist. But legacy is cruel. It's not just about what you gave, it's about how you left. And Jorge's final act, 4 losses, a criminal case, and a quiet retreat from the spotlight, made fans question if the magic was ever real or just a well-timed story. New fans don't remember Strikeforce Masvidal. They remember the flying knee, the Trump rallies, the Colby beef. And as time goes on, that memory gets blurrier. He's already being confused with copycats, his name trending less, his highlights buried under newer knockouts. Even the BMF belt, once a symbol of his peak, was reintroduced in 2023 without him. And that might be the most painful part. The belt moved on. The sport moved on. But Jorge Masvidal, the man who once made us all believe in grit, violence, and the comeback, is still frozen in memory, somewhere between the street and the spotlight.